Let's move on to sets. So a set, I think many of you are familiar with the idea of a set. It's just a collection of objects. For example, the set of all the students that are taking Math 107 right now at GCC could be a set. We could also have a set of all the Oscar winners for Best Actress over the years. Okay, so it's just a collection of objects. The objects in a set are called the elements. So that might be a new vocabulary word for some of you, are called the elements of the set. So we have several ways of representing sets. And we may write a set by listing the elements, and it's always between these curly braces. Curly braces look like this. Okay, these are our curly braces. So anytime you're indicating a set, you want to make sure you use those braces. So if we can list the elements, in other words, your set is finite, this idea of listing each element is called the roster method. So some of you might be familiar with the word roster, like a class roster. I have a roster with all of your names on it. So very similarly, I could create a set using the roster method of the names of students in my Math 107 class. So for example, I could let the capital letter A represent the set of the Three Stooges. In this case, we would say capital letter A equals, and we would start with our curly braces, and we would list the Three Stooges, Larry, Moe, and Curly. And notice that you always use a comma in between your elements. And the order does not matter here. You could have said Curly, Moe, and Larry. Okay. So in the roster method, we use commas to separate the elements of the set. So now I'm going to let B represent the set of the 4 Beatles that arrived at the John F. Kennedy Airport in 1964. And here's a picture of the Beatles arriving at JFK in 1964. So B, capital B, is going to represent the set. So I'm going to give you a minute to think about if you could name these Beatles, and then we'll take a look. So if we're going to use the roster method, I have to do my curly brace. And I know that one of my Beatles was Paul McCartney. I'm just going to use initial for the last name. If I look at this picture, Paul McCartney's right here. John Lennon, George Harrison, and finally Ringo Starr. And then you end with a curly brace. Okay, so that represents the set of the 4 Beatles that arrived in JFK in 1964. Okay, and this is just a reminder, you have to use your curly braces. Right. A lot of the sets that we're going to encounter in this class will typically be sets that involve numbers. And we will use several methods to represent sets of numbers. Typically, sets of numbers are infinite, so it would be impossible to list everything using the roster method. So we have these 3 methods. We have the set builder notation, we have interval notation, and we have the real number line as ways to represent sets of numbers. So probably the set builder notation at first appears to be a little like weird, but it's very useful in parts of the course that you'll prefer to use it as a quick way to illustrate a set. And what it does is it gives you a way to describe how do you become a member of this set. What is true about you or what's false about you. So generally speaking, it has this form. You always, of course, start with your curly braces, and then you put your variable that you're using, your independent variable. So the set of all x, that's how we start to read this. And this vertical line here, we read as such that. So the set of all x such that x meets some condition. Okay, so if x meets this condition, it's part of the set. And if it isn't, you're kicked out. Okay, so this part here that meets some condition is some testable statement. It's a fact, or it could be an equation, or it could be an inequality. So for example, if I wrote this set right here, let's highlight it, using set builder notation to describe this set is all real numbers, not just the integers, but all real numbers, including fractions and irrational numbers that are greater than the number 2. So if we were to read this, this would say the set of all real numbers x such that x is greater than 2. So I know if the value of x is 0, it is not going to be part of this set because 0 is not greater than 2. So that's set builder notation. Now, we can use a real number line to indicate this set as well. A real number line has arrows at either end, and you use some kind of intervals here. We're looking at every number, integer, positive integer, and negative integer, with these spaces of 1. And notice that I've used this sort of parenthesis type of notation here at 2, and then I've colored in my number line to the right of that with an arrow. Some of you may be more familiar with this type of indication on your number line. You would put an open circle and then shade everything to the right. That's another way number lines are used to indicate all real numbers larger than 2. Our book uses this notation here because of the very next notation called interval notation, which will be used throughout the book and throughout your homework on MyMathLab. And the interval notation for this set of numbers looks like this. Notice it has a parenthesis, and that parenthesis is similar to the notation used right here on the number line. And that parenthesis says we're not including the number 2. We're starting at 2, but we don't include it. Okay, comma, and then the last, so this is always your smaller number of the 2 numbers in your notation. And then the last number, well, there is no last number. This goes all the way to positive infinity. So we use the infinity symbol, and then again we use parentheses because you cannot include infinity. There's no endpoint here. So that's 2 different ways to write the set all numbers greater than 2, either with a number line or the interval notation. All right, suppose you wanted to include a number, like suppose you wanted to include a set, or you wanted to represent a set that said all numbers from 1 to 4. Okay, all numbers from 1 to 4, excuse me, from -1 to 4. Well, now we're actually including -1 and 4 because you see these brackets. And I often call them staples. That's how I'd like to think of them, because they look like staples. And when you staple something, you're including it. So this goes from -1 to 4. So in interval notation, I would start with my 2 brackets. And I'm looking at the smaller number here being -4 and the larger number being 4. Excuse me, -1 and the larger number being 4. Okay, so that's how I would use interval notation to describe this set. Now, what about this one here, the second one? Here, I'm starting at 1, and I'm looking at all real numbers less than 1, all the way to -infinity. So 1 here is actually my larger number. That's going to sit on the right-hand side of the interval with my bracket, and -infinity comes first, and I use a parenthesis. So you'll have lots of practice with interval notation in your homework. Again, the parenthesis is used to indicate that the number is not included, the endpoint that it represents is not included, and a bracket is to indicate that the number or the endpoint is included. Okay, so class activity will be another video for you, so I will talk to you about this in just a bit.